So welcome everybody, welcome to this live Zoom chat. We're delighted to welcome Father Gregory Boyle, also known affectionately as Father G. That's how he's been described to me. This is Dynamic Creations, Transformational Coaching. My name's Gerald Neal. The purpose of these live Zoom chats is to bring people together to talk about spirituality and personal development, but also to highlight the work that we're doing through Cisco, running recovery cafes in the adult prisons here in Scotland, HMRC Berlin and HMRC Shotts, and soon to be Edinburgh and a few other prisons, looking at emotional regulation skills for long-term adult prisoners, also anger management, substance misuse, and really providing a supportive environment where we can really look at dealing with causes rather than symptoms. And in this process, symptoms will be behaviour that's resulted in people being incarcerated, put in prison. And what we're really looking at is if we can change the cause, then there is no symptoms. And I'm sure we'll listen and we'll learn a great deal from Father G, who is the founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, California, the biggest gang re-intake, rehabilitation and re-entry program anywhere in the world. Father Boyle is a New York best-selling author of Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion. He's received the California Peace Prize, inducted into the Californian Hall of Fame. He's been named Champion of Change in 2014 by none other than President Barack Obama. 2017, the L'Oreal Medal from Notre Dame University, the oldest honour given to American Catholics. He's a Jesuit priest, and his story is just amazing. We're absolutely delighted to have you here, Father G. And with that, I will just pass it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with all of you. I hope you can hear me okay. It's very early here, so there are other sleeping Jesuits in the house, so I want to be mindful of that. I should explain the title. It says the whole language, the power of extravagant tenderness. And so once I was invited to testify for this guy named David, and I went to the federal building and they wanted to deport him. You know, I didn't know him that well. I knew him from detention facilities, and then they wanted to deport him not to Mexico or to Central America, but to Uzbekistan, because he came to this country when he was 11 with his mother, fleeing, and they settled in some East Side neighborhood, and he got into a Latino gang. And so they wanted to deport him after he had done 10 years in prison. So, you know, long story short, they didn't deport him, and he came and he worked at Homeboy for a time. But when I went back to the office after testifying, I ran into this guy, Louis, and I said, "Hey, do you know this guy, David?" He goes, "Oh, you know, I love that guy, you know, we call him Russian Boy." And he said, "You know, we were cellies in the same cell at county jail. And every night he'd go out into the hall and he'd talk on the phone to his mother, and he talked Russian." And he said, "Damn, gee, he spoke the whole language," which was his way of saying that David was fluent, that he spoke it in its fullness. So what I want to suggest is that we're trying to find a way to speak the whole language in the work that we do. And at Homeboy Industries, every person walks through those doors barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. So that's kind of where I want to begin. You know, the Christmas carol says, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth." And so part of what you do for a living is, even though that song's about Jesus and about Christmas, It's really your job description. You appear and the soul feels its worth. And that's exactly right. That's as it should be. Yesterday was my mom's birthday, and she died a couple years ago at 92 years old. And she wasn't one bit afraid of dying. She, in fact, once about a month before she died, she with exhilaration, she said, "I've never done this before." And she was like thrilled, like she was about to do skydiving. And so she was ready to go, you know, and once I was sitting by her bed, and which rarely happened, I was alone and she was asleep. When she woke up, she saw me there, and she went, "Oh, for crying out loud," and she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed that she was angry that she was still alive, you know, sorry. So then, you know, during this time, I have 8 brothers and sisters, and we were all gathered around the bed, you know, 2 or 3 or all 8 of us, and she'd be in and out of consciousness. Whenever she came to, she would zero in on one of us, and she would just have this laser beam focus, and she'd look at us and she'd say, "You're here, you're here." And that's also your job description. Loving, caring adult who pays attention and shows up. There's nothing more powerful than that. At Homeboy, the gang members there always say, "We're used to being watched. We're not used to being seen." And that's what you do. You imagine a circle of compassion, and then you imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And then you go to the margins, and it's the only way they'll ever get erased is because you chose to stand out at them. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And you stand with those who are easily despised and readily left out. You choose to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And you stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you stand out at the margins, and every one of you, and I know many of you, you know, people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You go to the margins and you say, "You're here, you're here." And the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. Service is a funny thing, you know, because it's where we begin, but we don't want to end. You know, service is the hallway that leads to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of kinship and connection. You don't want to just stop there. I remember a guy, a former gang member who was working with gang members in Houston, Texas. After a talk, he came up to me and pleaded with me, and he said, "How do you reach them?" And I found myself saying, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? Can you allow yourself to receive them and to have your heart altered? Because if you can do that, then each of you enters into this place of exquisite mutuality. Each of you assumes and feels empowered by your own dignity and nobility. That's how it works, I think, you know. And you don't want to stay in the hallway of service, which is a good place to start, because then it's kind of superior, you know, service provider, service recipient. And you don't want that. You don't want that distance. Cesar Chavez, who was the great community organizer of the farm workers in California, and he was a friend of mine. And every time you talk to him, he was just listening to you. He was never seeing if somebody more important is the mayor coming over. No, it was just you. He paid attention only to you. It was as if his whole being said, "You're here, you're here." And once famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And he just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." And that's what we're hoping for, is this exquisite mutuality where there is no us and them, there's just us. And that's the hope. And the soul feels its worth. And you move beyond watching people to actually seeing them. So Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago in 1988 when I was pastor of a very poor parish in Los Angeles. We had 8 gangs at war with each other. And it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi, what you would call estates, very poor people living there. And we had 8 gangs, which meant that we had the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere in the whole city and the world, really. And so I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And I'll bury my 234th this week, sometime, not sure when, a homie named David, who I've known all his life. So we did a lot of things. First thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school age gang members who didn't have any place to go because they had been kicked out of their home school. And so they were wreaking havoc in the housing projects. They were writing on the walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. So I walked out to them from my office at the parish and I would kind of isolate them and I'd say, "Hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one said, "Yeah, you know, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them. So we started a school. That was the first thing we did. And that brought large numbers of gang members to the church property. We were up on the 3rd floor of the elementary school. And I remember, you know, I had right across the street from the church was the convent, which was on the 3rd floor. And I gathered all the nuns together. And we sat in their living room and I said, "Hey, would you mind, you know, moving out and we could turn the school into the convent into a school for gang members?" And they said, "Sure." And so we were off and running. People in the parish kind of pushed back. They said, "Aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? You know, good people in and bad people out." And so that was a good gospel challenge. And so it was a tough school. You know, they were fights every single day. Once I had a principal who lasted exactly 1 month, which was, and that was, you know, a record. And so then they kept saying, if only we had jobs, you know, and so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the projects to all these factories that surrounded, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started to invent things. We had a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our childcare center on the property at the church, all made up of rival enemy gang members. And so, and in 1992, we went through a moment, as we are unfortunately going through right now, of great unrest after the Rodney King verdict. The whole city ignited and exploded. As it is right now, we're trying to figure out how to transform our anguish into action that advances justice, and it's difficult. So every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles ignited in 1992, except my community, the poorest community in the city. And so a movie producer named Ray Stark read in the LA Times that our community hadn't ignited, and summoned me to his office. He happened to have $500 million. And he said, what should I do with my money? You know, and I can see now that I woefully undershot my request, but I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from the school. You could purchase it. We could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members, and they could bake bread, and we could call it Homeboy Bakery. And that was the extent of my business plan. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. Homeboy Bakery was kind of famous. You know, it was, got a lot of attention because nobody had really done anything like this before. If you keep in mind, our first 10 years, we had hate mail, death threats, bomb threats. All the anonymous mail really came from law enforcement officers who would say things like, we hate you, you're part of the problem. And they had so demonized our population, you know, it was hard to get beyond. But Homeboy Bakery was famous, you know, because rival enemy gang members were working side by side with each other. That had never happened. So it became a place where people would come. You know, there would be, you know, busloads of Japanese tourists and news crews. And once Prince Charles's business advisors came, something of a culture clash. And so our foreman was a guy named Roman, and Roman was probably the biggest drug dealer I ever knew, and I knew all of them. Every time I offered him help, he just said, oh, I'm okay. Until one day he said, I'm ready. Can you hire me? And so I did right away. I don't know why it changed for him. In recovery, you know, they say it takes what it takes. For a gang member, it's the same thing. It can be the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Roman, I think it was his daughter, Clarissa, who had been born. That kind of changed him, I guess. Anyway, so he came to work at the bakery, and before too long, I made him the foreman. And not only did he work with his enemies, he supervised them, which is really a great deal more difficult. And so, you know, he was very good at that. But the part he hated was that he needed to host all these tour guides, you know, and all these people who needed a tour, all these busloads and the news crews. And so this one day, a busload of farmers, people who owned farms in Central California, were coming to see the famous Homeboy Bakery. And I remember he and I were standing out in the parking lot waiting for them to arrive, and he was having a bad attitude day. He didn't want to give this tour. He hated it. And then the bus pulls in and I'm waving. I say, you can park right there. And it was a huge, slick, sleek, ultra-modern bus that has the microphone up in front. And Roman sees the microphone and he pretends he's the tour guide. And he says, welcome to Homeboy Bakery. Observe gang members in their natural habitat. Please keep your hands in the bus at all times. Do not feed the homies. They are not yet tame. You know what I'm saying? Shush, you know, and everybody gets off the bus and I greet them and I leave them with Roman. So I go to my office in those days, which was some blocks away. And when I came back, I asked him, I said, how did that tour go? And he said, damn, gee, what's up with white people? I said, I don't know. What is up with us? And he said, well, they always be using the word great. I said, really? He goes, yeah, check this out. These white people come into our bakery and they see the machines and the ovens and everything's clean and working. And they said, this place is great. And then they see the homies, gang members, enemies working side by side with each other. You fellas are great. And then they try the bread and they said, wow, this bread, it's great. He said, why is it that white people always be using the word great? And I said, I don't know, I'd never heard this before. But trust me, from that day forward, every opportunity I could find, I told him how great he was, just to mess with them, you know. So cut to like 6 months later, I pull into the parking lot at night when they would close around 11. And Roman rushes me at the car, and he's never excited about anything, this guy. And so he's, I can barely get out of the car, and he goes, check this out. You're not going to believe what happened yesterday. So he tells me that he goes to pick up his 4-year-old daughter, Clarissa, at the babysitter's. And he puts her in the car, and he drives to his humble little apartment where for the first time in his life, he's paying rent with honestly earned, clean, decent money. And he unlocks the door, and Clarissa goes running down this tiny hallway, and she plants herself in the living room, and she extends her arms wide, and she looks at the room and takes it in with her eyes, and she says, this is great. And Roman said, I thought she was turning white on me. And he gets down at knee level and looks her in the eye and says, what's great? And Clarissa clutches her chest with great emotion. And she says, my home. And as soon as he says that, his eyes fill up with tears, and so do mine. And we stare at each other for what seems an eternity, and tears roll down our cheeks, and we just stare at each other. And finally, I break the silence, and I said, you did this. You never had a home in your life. Now you have one. You did this. You used to be the biggest drug dealer in town, and you stopped, and you baked bread instead. You did this. You've never had a father in your life, and now you are one. And I hate to have to tell you, but you're great. And I hate to have to tell you that the first time I ever retrieved that story to tell it in public was at his funeral. He wasn't doing anything wrong when he was killed. He was packing the trunk of his car. He was going to go on a camping trip. And 2 guys came into his part of the housing projects, and they had their face covered. And they saw him, and they must have thought, he'll do. And they executed him. But in the time that spanned his death to his funeral, his friends and homies kept asking me this question, and I thought it was a good one. They would say, what's the point of doing good if that can happen to you? And I thought it was a good question and worthy of a response. And so I stood up in that very packed church that night, and I told that story, and I said, here's the point. Before Roman left us, he knew the truth of who he was, that he was exactly what God had in mind when God made him. And then he became that truth. He inhabited that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's great. And the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. Each one of you is called to be an enlightened witness, a person who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we really are allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. We don't do that. We hold the mirror up and we tell them the truth. And your truth is my truth, and that truth was Roman's truth. You're exactly what God had in mind when God made you. But every homie who walks through our doors comes with a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And so the first stop, and all of you know this, the first stop in kind of getting to the place of healing is a safe place, a sanctuary, if you will. And then the homies become the sanctuary they sought. And then they go home and they present that sanctuary to their kids. And suddenly, for the first time, you've broken a cycle. And then after 18 months with us, they leave us. And suddenly they're renewed. They have re-identified who they are in the world, and they're resilient. And now the world will throw at them what it will, but this time they won't be toppled by it. You know better than I do, James and Colum, and you know the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, and the people who write books on this, you have the 10 checklists, parent in prison, mental illness in the house, substance abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. It's a list of 10 things. And the experts say that if a kid has 4 or 5 of those, this kid is going to have health issues and socializing issues. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I'm a 0 on the ACEs. But every single man and woman who walks through our doors at Homeboy is a 9 or a 10, every single one. All the women are 10 because they will admit that they have been sexually abused. The guys are less likely to admit that, which is just enormous. And, how do you get them to see the truth of who they are? Because shame and disgrace is the principal suffering of the poor. And how do you address that? In the Acts of the Apostles, it has this odd line, and it says, "And awe came upon everyone." Our task always is to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. How do we get to a place where we are reverent for the complexity of what people suffer? I remember I was had agreed to go speak in Richmond, Virginia, and they invited me, and it was for a gang in service, which meant I presume they wanted me to do a keynote or give like an address at lunch or something. And it's all these social workers who get credit from 9 to 5, and they fill a hotel ballroom. And, I said, yes, I bought my ticket. And then a week before I was to fly, I pulled out the letter and I saw that I wasn't going to be a keynote speaker. I was the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said, oh, hell no. So I called 2 homies in, Jose and Andre, and they're trainees and they're like in their 9th month at Homeboy. And I sit them down. I said, look, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia in a week. I want you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time, because we have a long ass day to fill. So we get there, and Jose gets up, and he's 25 years old. And a gang member, been to prison, tattooed. At that point, he was a member of our substance abuse team. He was helping them out. He was helping younger homies with their addiction issues. A man in full recovery himself, had been a heroin addict, and now he was helping others. And he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess, I don't know, you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worse in Spanish, he said to them, and they all went from gasp to laugh. And then he continued, he said, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California. And she walks me up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door and the guy comes to the door and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred, and in fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And suddenly he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of your compassion lies not in your service of those on the margins, but only in your willingness to see yourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this, if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And I think that happens all the time, and sadly, it's happening in my country. So how do we stand at the margins? You don't go to the margins to make a difference, because then it's about you. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make me different. And then it's about us. If you go to the margins to make a difference, then you'll burn out. Anybody who burns out truly is, you've allowed it to become about you. But the second you allow it to be about the other, then you can delight in the present moment and you can delight in the person right in front of you. And that is eternally replenishing. Let me end with this story and then allow you to ask questions. There was a kid, we all called him Bandit, and he was a bandit. He was a gang member, and he would ride his bike up to cars and sell crack cocaine. in Aliso Village housing project. And he was also one who resisted any of my offers for help until one day he walked into Homeboy Industries. I couldn't believe it. I asked him why. And he said, well, you've all heard this before. I was tired of being tired. So he worked at Homeboy and he worked on himself, and he came to terms with what was done to him as a kid. And he transformed his pain so he didn't have to inflict it anymore. He didn't have to transmit it. And he found healing, and he found the truth of who he was. And then after his 18 months with us, we were able to send him to this kind of entry-level job, a warehouse. And before too long, he became the supervisor of the warehouse. And he was in charge of the whole place, and he bought a house, and he got married, and he had 3 kids. And I hadn't heard from him in a long time, and he called me on a Friday afternoon, and his voice had panic in it. And he says, gee, you have to bless my daughter. I said, why? What, is she sick, or is she in the hospital? And he said, oh, no, on Sunday, she's going to Humboldt College. Imagine, my Jessica, my oldest. But Humboldt's very far, it's way up north, and she's a little tiny thing, and I don't know, we're afraid for her, so could you give her a blessing? I said, sure. So I said, I have baptisms tomorrow at 1, so come to the church at 12:30. So they all come, Bandit and his wife and the 3 kids, including tiny little Jessica. So I put them in we make a circle around Jessica, and we put our hands on her and on her shoulders. I say, go ahead, put your hand on her head. Everybody touch her, connect to her. And I say, bow your heads and close your eyes. And as the homies say, I do a long ass prayer. I go on. And somewhere in the middle of this prayer, I notice we've all become chillones, which means everybody's crying. And everybody's kind of messy crying, including me. And I don't know why we're crying, except for the fact that nobody in Bandit's family, they don't know anybody who's ever gone to college, except me, but certainly nobody in their family. And so, we kind of wipe our eyes and we laugh about how mushy we got. And I kind of change the subject, and I look at Jessica, I say, hey, what are you going to study at Humboldt College? And she was very quick. She said, forensic psychology. And I go, damn, forensic psychology. And Bandit says, yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind. And then Jessica turns and looks at her father, and she does one of these, and Bandit sees her, and he says, yep, I'm going to be her first subject. So we walk out to the parking lot, we say goodbye, big hugs, and everybody piles in the car except Bandit. He hangs back. And I said, I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become. I'm proud of you. And I'm proud of the fact that you have chosen to walk in your own footsteps. And his eyes fill up with tears, and he says, I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them. And I said, yeah, I guess you did. And the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. What you do for a living is noble and true and right and just. And you're always turning anguish into action. And you go to the margins not to make a difference, but so that people will make you different. And yes, people will always accuse you of wasting your time. But in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness. the voices of those who sing. Go to the margins and make those voices heard. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, thank you very much. Just incredibly powerful. I'm glad you've just went for some water and you weren't deciding to leave us there. Thank you very much for sharing that. Phenomenal, just phenomenal 40 minutes or so. I felt really energised, moved, motivated, inspired. Incredible stories, and thanks very much for using some very personal stories as well. And I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of stories that you could tell from the incredible Homeboy Industries. But I would just like, I'm going to take some questions just now, but just some observations and some questions. I'll form that as a question. So when we train as therapists, we're asked to create a stabilised environment, so a safe environment for, and we create that, so stabilise initially, and then when stabilisation's occurred, which could be stress management, but also it could be that if we take people from addiction and put them in a rehabilitation centre, we put people from the court systems and put them in the criminal justice, we put them in prisons, or we take children from their parents and we put them into orphanages or residential childcare environments, then initially, in my own experience and what I've seen in my professional life, is often in these controlled, stable environment, if the conditions are right, people flourish. But we in Scotland don't go much further than that, because we don't use that stabilisation to create the change, the deep healing process, to really look at causes. So we deal with symptoms. So symptoms could be antisocial behaviour, so we'll put them in prison. Symptoms could be chronic drug or alcohol use, so if they're fortunate enough, we put them into residential rehabs. Some work goes on in there, but initially we miss the causes. But then we expect, particularly from the prison population, stabilised adults who get 3 meals a day. Often they'll make it into physical education. If they're fortunate, they might get actual education, access to education, but they might do well, their drug use is regulated to an extent, but then we expect them to be that stabilised and come back into their own environments, which is often back into their own communities where there are massive traumatic experiences have happened in the past and are traumatising. We expect them to maintain, and often what happens is it's just a return to the former life, where the coping strategies are much more required. So we don't use that period of stabilisation to change. So we just go from stabilisation to get people to maintain. What do you do in Homeboy Industries for the change? So you create a safe environment. So you bring people in. You mentioned an 18-month programme. Ross Stewart, who done a talk before you, has visited, and he mentioned that there's anger management classes, that there's parenting classes, that there's access to 12-step fellowships if they would choose to do that. What is the change work that happens in the 18-month process?
Well, I think we always do this battle between content and context. And context is always primary. You know, content is secondary. So a lot of times we think what these folks need is anger management classes, training, instruction, coping skills. All those things are good, but it's the relational wholeness that heals. So that's where you want to begin. Community of tenderness. You know, if it's true that a traumatized person will cause trauma, a damaged person will damage others, a cherished person will find their way to the joy there is of cherishing. So that's kind of key, because unless the context is cherishing, that fosters a relational wholeness, because the relationship is everything. That's what heals. And so you can have the case, as we do, where people do go back and they have to live right there, you know, where things had been traumatic. But they're not going to be toppled, because they're connected to relationship that has allowed them to cherish themselves and others. So it makes them strong and resilient. But we always think it's about insert message here. They lack data, they lack message, they lack instruction. They just don't know enough. And consequently, you know, we punish wound in our societies rather than heal them. We send them to prison, but they're all in pain, they're all wounded, they're all damaged, they're all traumatized, every single one. The largest mental institution in the world is Los Angeles County Jail. What does that tell you about how we deal with things? So once we shift, but you know, every program that I know in the country, in the United States, we all have the same menu of services, you know, anger management, this class, 12-step, we all have the same services. What I think the secret sauce is a community of tenderness, an extravagant tenderness that's sort of surprising and beyond what anybody expects. And that's the key. The more you can foster a community or stay connected in relationship with people, that's what heals and that's what sustains.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And, I'm going to ask if Callum, who set this up, who put us together, and also James Docherty would like to come in. Just raise your hands if that's the case. But we have a question from David Pentland, so I'll just ask you to unmute yourself, David, and just to form a question rather than a share back, if possible.
I'm part of a mobilisation team that's tasked with trying to end homelessness in Glasgow, and one of the underpinning factors of the more entrenched homelessness is trauma. And I hear your message of tenderness and stuff like that, but was there any specific disciplines that you use to tackle the kind of rawness of people's trauma? Any kind of therapies or stuff like that?
Yeah, we have, you know, groups. We have 4 paid therapists and 49 volunteer therapists, including 3 psychiatrists. So that is going on, as well as the community of tenderness that receives them and helps them feel safe. The same is like with homelessness, you know, it's like the first step is safe place. And then they can kind of find their way and you help them. You know, some people need medication, and some people need, you know, recovery and 12 steps and maybe 90 days in a rehab before they can kind of get stabilized. But you know, there's a campaign here in Los Angeles directed by the Department of Mental Health, and their slogan is, "None of us are well until all of us are well." And so it's a way of saying what Mother Teresa used to say: the problem in the world is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. So the first step in any city is to say the homeless belong to us. We don't dismiss them, demonize them. We don't eliminate them from our view. We imagine a circle of compassion, and we imagine everyone standing within that circle, including the homeless. So it's I don't know if there's certain methodologies, except we do them all, you know, in terms of therapy and group, but all that stuff is secondary, it seems to me, to the context that you create. And maybe people can't create the community like at Homeboy in a sense, but you know, you are the community, you are the connection, you are the, you know, the loving, caring adult who pays attention. You're the one who sees them and their soul feels the worth. And so you pull the favor out of them, and suddenly in your presence, they feel favorable. And that's a powerful moment. You're not giving them anything. You're not bestowing something on them. But in your presence, they're able to inhabit their nobility and goodness, their unshakable, resounding goodness, which is the truth of who they are. But they've had to carry more than most people have had to carry in trauma and damage and, you know. And so I just think it's huge. You know, the Baptists in the United States always say, you may be the only Bible somebody reads. Well, the idea is you may be it. You may be the only loving, caring adult who pays attention. And that's just astoundingly powerful and huge.
Thanks for that question.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, David. Father G, we've got a couple of questions that's come up in the chat. So the sort of observations, but they've been framed as questions as well. So I'll put them to you. One question is, how can we get the community to support a prison initiative when it clearly resists the work we do? And it sort of goes back to when you started your cell, you were getting the hate mail and the police were completely against it. What advice could you give Natalie to overcome the barriers to the projects that she runs? A similar stuff inside long-term prisons, often with life sentence prisoners that spent a long time, and there's massive barriers, which is obviously, we sent an email to Christie saying we're putting a donation on this chat, and would it be okay if we could keep it, because we get zero funding, we just rely on donations, and that was just asking, what did you do to overcome that, to get the support of the local community?
Yeah, I think you just can't give up, you know, and you stand in the right place, you do what you know is true and right and just, and part of the thing is you have to, we shake our fist a lot, and we try to appeal to people's conscience, maybe even to their guilt, but appeal to people's goodness and invite them to vicinity, you know, to the vicinity of where the homeless live or where the returning citizen is. Because you cannot demonize people you know, and once people are in the vicinity of the other and the stranger and the widow and the orphan, you know, then you can't maintain your distance anymore. And that's where support comes. You know, we always think it's about winning the argument or convincing people, support our prison initiative. But the more you can gently invite people to their own goodness and invite them to stand there with you. You know, we have 300 volunteers, and they're changed by being there. They become their best selves, and they find their true selves in loving. And so it couldn't happen unless they are invited into the vicinity of the other, of the poor, of the returning citizen, or in prisons. You know, the more you can get people. But I think things have changed. You know, I can't, you know, it's hard to retrieve the time when we got death threats. And they weren't from gang members, they were from people who demonized gang members. So, but it's been a long time. And so even though in our country right now we have absolute unrest because of the killing of George Floyd, you know, I've been around the block a long time. I've buried over 30 human beings killed by police. And still you make progress in the good, you know, and I think people generally in the world are more inclined to be smart on crime rather than tough on crime. But I don't know if that's your experience in Glasgow or in Scotland. I'm sure it's evolved and changed.
The challenge we have is funding. So it's difficult, really difficult for small charities to access any form of funding. Because there's professional funders, there's people who employ professionals to write funding applications. We rely entirely on volunteers, people who's been through the project We Volunteer to gain integrity, but also that live experience. Here's a person that's come through this process and look how well they're doing now, they're reintegrated back in society. And on that point, can I just thank, we've got maybe about 50, 60 pounds being donated. Can I just thank people, because that money, here's an example, a very human story. 2 weeks ago, a man who was stabilised because he attended the recovery cafes in prison, doing extremely well, gets released from prison, homeless, back into his environment, goes on a chaotic drug and alcohol-fueled bender, finds himself homeless, destitute, suicidal, and really at the end of his web, he remembers one telephone number. That one telephone number is somebody who's been through the project, has been through the recovery cafes, and is reintegrated into society. Even though we're on lockdown, he phones the one number he remembers. That person meets him, gets funds for a telephone, a top-up voucher, and from that he's now got community, he's got connection, so now we can support him. Natalie goes, picks him up, takes him to homeless hostels to find him a place where he can go and stay, accesses him into a 12-step recovery community and mental health services. That's the fundamental roles that we play in this charity. But the challenge is that the perception still of people in prison, it's much more easier to support homeless initiatives where lots of people are doing it. But what we're saying is, often the people who are homeless have came from institutions. So they've came from institutions and now they're on the street. Now that they're on the street, we'll support them with, which is brilliant, fantastic initiatives, but we've got an opportunity to stop that. And I like the thing where teach a man to fish, he'll feed himself forever. Whereas if you give him a fish, he'll feed him for a day. Same. Teach a person how to be a parent, and then we don't need to look after, the state does not need to look after that child. They can look after them themselves. And there's opportunities that we can do that. There is periods of stability, sometimes in institutions, rehabs, or in our own stuff, like Callum's going to come in and speak about a project that's in Glasgow that's modelled, influenced, motivated by your own. So Callum, you're free just to come in.
Cheers, Jed. Thanks for putting this on, mate. And I'll thank G for coming on and giving up his time to come and speak to us. And I've had the privilege of meeting G and stuff like that, and seeing Homeboy like other people on this the day, and it's a phenomenal place. But I suppose I've just got a few questions, G. I know the answers to them, but many people on this Zoom chat might not know them. And it was basically, what motivated you to do something, a Jesuit priest to do something and within your community with gang members? What was that motivation, and what keeps you motivated to continue 30 years down the line to keep helping gang members? And how many people go through Homeboy Industries? How many people per year goes through that program?
Yeah, so about 15,000 people a year walk through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives or redirect them. There are 120,000 gang members in LA County, 1,100 gangs. So I think, because we've been around for a long time, I don't think there is an area code or a zip code or a postal code in Los Angeles County that has gangs that wouldn't have gang members from those gangs come to us. So, but you know, a lot of, and you've been, Colin, you've been, and James, you've been to our headquarters. So, but a lot of times people look at it and they go, how'd you think this up? You know, and I kind of didn't do any of that. I mean, I backed my way into things, you know, and I evolved my way. And so, whereas I wanted to work with the poor and I spoke Spanish, that kind of set me at Dolores Mission. And just because I was there during what I call the decade of death, 88 to 98, when we had 1,000 gang-related homicides in 1992. So I was there at this historic moment. And you had a choice, you know, you could bury your head in the sand or you could respond. So a lot of it was just response. It wasn't like, you know, I had this plan or I plotted it out, or it wasn't even like I felt, you know, particularly called to work with gang members until I started to work with gang members. And then I felt fully alive and exactly where I was supposed to be. So what keeps me going? It's, you know, so we're all on lockdown, and I presume you guys are. And so I went back to the office for the first time yesterday, and they've set up this kind of weird tent outside. So they're so worried about me because I'm old and I have leukemia. So they're just terrified of having me there. It's really fascinating. So they've set up this tent that has my office in it, you know, and they have everything, you know, the chairs are 6 feet away from me. Everybody's wearing a mask. And everybody is kind of distant, and it's okay. You know, it's weird because they don't want me in the building because they feel like somehow, you know, the virus will be flying in the air, and they're deathly afraid of me getting it. I'm just sort of surrendering to it, whatever they want me to do. But the homies have planned this whole thing. So there I am in this tent. And yesterday was the first time I was there, and I was there just in the morning. And we're kind of in a modified reopening because we can't afford to have all our people, hundreds and hundreds together. So we're trying to, some are coming on Monday and Wednesday, some are coming on Tuesday and Thursday. Anyway, all I can say, you asked me, Colin, what keeps me going? Oh my God, just sitting there yesterday and being in their presence. And I feel so humbled to know them and to be with them. And it, you know, it's such a privilege. And there was a homie covered in tattoos wearing a mask, and he was sitting there, and he just said, sometimes I just feel so alone. And I think this time of quarantine has really kind of done a number on people. They're really it's hard, you know. But you know, I said, hey, you know, you're good company. Don't see it as loneliness, see it as solitude. And I love being with you, and I hope you'll find the same thing for yourself, you know. But I also have to say that, you know, I love you guys in your community in Glasgow, and I've been so heartened to be there with you, and to see Street and Arrow, and to see you working, and to see you loving people, and that you don't pummel them into submission. You love them into their truest selves, and it's so heartening to view, and I feel so honored that we're partners in this, you know, and there's a kind of a network of a modality of tenderness and care, and it's a movement, you know. What if we did care first, and prison, you know, as a truly last resort? What if we tended to people and paid attention and didn't allow anybody to fall through the cracks? And demonizing is the opposite of who you are. And so people will be compelled, as Gerald was saying, they'll give you money because they'll know how important your efforts are in the world. And yeah.
Brilliant.
Thanks, G.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Can I just ask, Father G, so how many men and women go through the project at the same time? So it's an 18-month project. What's your capacity?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's a very fluid thing. You know, we have senior staff, and that's about 80 people who run the place. And then we have another, what we call core. And these are homies who have graduated from the program, but we need them to, you know, bake bread and teach others. So they're kind of a core. So we have 9 social enterprises. You know, bakery, lots of our restaurants are closed because that's the last thing to open. So we have a restaurant at City Hall, we have a restaurant at the airport, they're all closed. And so then we have something of, you know, 300 trainees at any given time. So we have all these case managers, navigators, who kind of pay attention to them, and they're kind of cohort groups where they're, you know, they get a sense of team and a sense of community in the small version, and then in our large version, which is hard to do right now because you just can't convene 300 people in hell, they won't even let me in the damn building. So it's really weird. But we'll get through this. My thing is, I hope that, this is a storm that's hit everybody. And there's a kind of unifying factor in that, except what we're recognizing is not everybody is in the same size vessel. Some people are in a cruise line and some are in a yacht, but other people are in inner tubes or dinghies or rowboats. So, and this is a worldwide global pandemic that impacts the poor disproportionately. In our country, it impacts poor communities of color. And, the pandemic didn't create this economic disparity and equity, but it's highlighted it. Our fault lines have been revealed, and that's probably a good thing. I think nobody wants to return to normal, because normal was bad. Normal was chaotic. Normal excluded. Normal didn't have equity. So we want the way better than normal. So I think this is an opportunity for the world really to put first things recognizably first.
Definitely.
I hope, anyway.
We have another question somebody's put on the chat. I don't know how we do it, but they've asked it, so I'll ask it. They said that they're not comfortable doing it. So they said that they work in statutory social work, and the biggest barrier to forming effective, nurturing relationships must be with the kids that they work with or the families they work with, is the entrenched cultures within the team. Can you advise if you experienced this and how you overcame this? And this sort of follows on to a point where in Scotland over a number of years we've done a thorough review of the childcare system. So we looked at all aspects: residential childcare, secure care, fostering, adoption, kinship care as well. And the biggest question that came out of that was the infants, young people and young adults, children asked for love. They wanted to be loved. They wanted to be in an environment that was a lifetime full of care. So when they were 18, they were not leaving that adoption or that foster home or residential childcare. They wanted a lifetime of care. And the big question was round about how can a system with all its child protection orders, safe practices, provide love? Because only a human being can provide that love. And the question is that, I suppose, it's how do you create a culture that is about kinship, that is about love, that is about healing, despite the fact that there needs to be boundaries and systems in place for things to operate. But how do you create that?
Yeah, a lot of times we get, you mentioned the word boundaries, and we hold back. And, it's interesting. When we wanted to, how long should our training program be? So we said a year, oh, that feels too short. 2 years, that's too long. How about 18 months? So it's an 18-month training program. Well, way later, we said, wow, 18 months is the period it takes to attach for an infant to their caregiver, to the mother or the father or whoever's taking care. And that's so essential, that 18-month attachment. And so we thought, 18 months. And we thought, well, that's what we're doing. We're engaged in attachment repair. And again, there's no other way to do it except to be in relationship. And maybe that bumps up against, boundary issues, but, it's, people need to feel cherished. And I don't know how you do it except by cherishing. And that's just, that's how people attach and reattach. And is it ever too late to do that? Boy, my experience is it's never too late to do that. But it requires cooperation of people. So no amount of me wanting that guy to have a life will ever be the same as that guy wanting to have a life. So you wait. And that's the thing, in the old days, we used to be undone if somebody left us or got rearrested or, went back to selling drugs or getting high. And we used to say, well, maybe he'll come back. We don't say that anymore. We say, he'll be back. Because once you get a dose of being cherished, oh my God, there's nothing more compelling than that. And that really keeps people coming back. So sometimes all the homies, that Colin and James know, who run the place, they, this was like their third time coming. And it's sort of like phases. It's like, it's the third step of their program, because part of what happens is once you get too close to your pain and you're excavating your wound, that's painful and it hurts. And so the temptation to self-medicate or to flee, but you can only lean into that pain in community. And that's what you want to offer people, is a palpable sense of it's safe for you to do that work here with us. But, you have to walk through our doors. We don't recruit, we don't cajole, we don't convince. We're ready when you are. But once they come in, it's a red carpet.
Great, fantastic. We've got another question. So Frank McDonald, you're unmuted, Frank.
Thanks, Jed. Thanks, boys, for setting it up. Father G, I'd like to thank you so much for really inspiring me today, and giving me quite a few ideas. I manage a project. I live in London. I've lived down here 36 years. Obviously, I'm from the East End of Glasgow. So I've got a project up here with 20 beds for ex-offenders. We've just had a wee bit of funding. Funding's hard for us to get as well, but we've just had a wee bit of funding to revamp a wee bit of it. So my experience of getting guys into the community is getting tougher and tougher, obviously, because it's harder to get into the prisons down here through security and stuff like that. So a lot of this stuff's been done on Zoom. But I have a dossier of my success rate, right, of guys staying in the community, no reoffending, and I work on a basis of 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. What are your statistics of the guys that you're working with? Obviously, you're working with a vaster amount of numbers than me, but what are your statistics of the boys staying in the community? Obviously, your peer supporters there who turn into working for you voluntary. Have you got statistics on how many people stay out and stay away from the gang crime?
Yeah, I'm not good on that stuff. Somebody has those statistics. But I have kind of a philosophical take on it. And I know that's what people want. People want to know evidence-based outcomes, and I go, yeah, whatever. I mean, I'm kind of with Mother Teresa on this one. She says, we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. So I think for me, what works is just to stay faithful to what you're doing. What's right and true and good and just. But part of the thing at Homeboy, we always say we're the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program on the planet. For me, that would be enough to funders, are you successful? I said, yeah, it's like Alcoholics Anonymous. It works if you work it. But part of the thing at Homeboy is gang members go there. They don't go any other place. And trust me, gang members are so smart. They wouldn't go to a place that didn't help them. They just wouldn't go. Our place would be empty, and we're never empty. So, for me, that's enough, but that may not be enough for funders. So, I have people, development people who collect the numbers, and, and that's important because people want to go, are you successful? Does it work? But I also, there are a lot of programs in the United States that work, but they don't help. Yeah, so they might statistically say, oh, wow, this is really working. And I go, yeah, but it's not helping. And so not everything that works helps, but everything that helps works. So do the thing that helps. And that's key for me, because a lot of times people think they're onto something, but they're really doing something that doesn't help, that has secondary kind of causal things, you know, and unintended consequences. And you know, what you're doing in your home helps. You know, it's a place that, you know, you just kind of, and you trust in the power of community and tenderness. And tenderness is the highest form of spirituality, you know. It's where you want to be, and it's the thing that most reflects the God we have. And that will always help people. And because it will always help people, it works.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you.
It's great. Thanks. Listen, we'll start wrapping that up just now. Thanks very much for giving us your time. You are an absolute legend, getting up at 3 a.m. so you can come on here at 3:30 a.m. It's actually 8 hours behind in Los Angeles. So thank you very much for that. And I'll just pass it back to you if you've got any closing comments, any thoughts, any observations.
Yeah, it's hard. You know, Emily Dickinson says, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, that sings the song without the words and never stops at all. And you are hopeful to people for whom there is a lethal absence of hope. So they look to you, and you're the carrier of hope, you know, and you're a palpable sense of, you know, you help them imagine their future until they can imagine their own. So may you never stop at all. Thank you for your good work. And I hope one day I want to get over there again, because I love it there. And I invite you to Homeboy. So once we're off house arrest.
Fantastic. Well, let me tell you, I would much rather come to Los Angeles than you come to Glasgow. Once that happens, well, absolutely, you can prepare a visit, but I'm sure we would like to come to Los Angeles first. So thank you very much for coming and really inspiring and motivating us. And really telling not just the history of Homeboy, the history of yourself, but making it really personal. We're talking about some really personal stories, some ending in tragedy, but the fact is that despite the fact that there was an execution for Romeo, then he still was managed to fulfil his role as being a father, which was just really a motive, that part for us. So thank you very much, Father G.
Sure.
And I look forward to coming to Los Angeles soon.
Thank you.